their observations on, what can we do in transportation to improve things? Where are things common for like all road users, and where are places that will need to just step up to make sure that everybody has the equity, the access, the ability to use our streets safely. So I do want to welcome our panelists today. Joan, you want to jump forward? And Nick Glenn with NETC, Northeast Transportation Connections, Stephanie Puello from Black Girls Do Bike, and Joliette Woodson from the City of Lafayette are all on the call. So Nick, if you'd like to get us started, just a quick introduction, tell us about yourself, your background, how did you wind up working in transportation?
I'm a transportation program assistant for NETC, and got here by the luck of the draw, actually. I started driving shuttles for NETC about 2 years ago, and that brought me into helping out with outreach, and then it just expanded from there. And this year, I went full-time, and COVID hit, so we're not doing as much outreach as we normally do. But yeah, that's how I got here.
Wonderful. Well, welcome. Glad to have you. And Stephanie, could you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do, both in your work life and with Black Girls Do Bike?
Sure. So hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie, and I'm originally from South Florida, but I've been in Denver now for 6 years. So in my day job, I actually work in higher ed, so I work at CU Denver. I'm also a PhD student in public affairs, so essentially study equitable policies in government. So in some ways that informs like my approach for pretty much everything, including my personal life. So to that extent, I started cycling in about 2014 while I was in Miami, and then that became significantly just a bigger hobby here. So with that, I was introduced to Black Girls Do Bike, which is a national organization that came from Monica Garrison out in the Pittsburgh area, but it has about 80 local chapters across the US now. So I was looking for the Denver one and there wasn't one, so I created it myself. So I founded that in 2017, so we're about 3 years old. So now I lead the Black Girls Do Bike Denver chapter, and we essentially go on monthly rides. And it's just been, a great experience getting to know more Black women cyclists and just helping encourage and motivating more Black women and women of color to ride on fitness.
Wonderful. Thank you for doing that. And Joliette, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Joliette Woodson, and I am also from South Florida originally, and I've been in Colorado since 2007. I got my transportation start a long time ago. I'm older than the other panelists, with the Texas Department of Transportation. I worked there for a few years. And over the years, I've worked in the private industry side, and I've been in the public side for quite a while now. When I first moved to Colorado, I was the transportation engineer for the City of Northland for 5 years. Then I was with the City of Louisville as their transportation engineer for 7 years, and I just joined the City of Lafayette. And I've been there a little bit less than a year. So typically, on the engineering side of things, it's the get or built. What I like about Lafayette is my position isn't just engineering, it's also planning. So I get to see the big picture and help my council understand the funding of things before they're actually built to make sure it works for everyone, hopefully.
Fabulous. Well, I wanted to kick things off with some questions. Of course, I've been doing a range of reading to just consider our situation. And I found a quote from urban geographer Leslie Kern, where she says, to create a great equitable city, it has to be a city that prioritizes how people get their basic needs met. And that's referring to food, shelter, and social connections. If we thought of those sort of things first, and then layer on top of that economic question of production and consumption, what would that change? What are your thoughts on that, Joliette?
Hey, do me a favor, read that one more time.
So, to create a great, equitable city, it should be a city that prioritizes how people get their basic needs met. So that refers to things like food, shelter, and social connection. If we thought of those things first, so meeting the needs first, and then on top of that, we came to the economics, production and consumption, what kind of changes do you think we'd see?
Well, I think that's every city's goal, and most cities have different types of plans, comprehensive plans from the planning department, all different types. So for the cities, first, it's understanding what people need, and then it goes into the plan, and then it gets funding attached to it, and then eventually gets built. Hopefully all of that in a time frame that actually achieves what we want it to achieve. So from the transportation side of things, coming up with that plan can be difficult if you don't reach everyone you need to hear from. So I think that's where the question was going from the transportation side of things, if I understood the question correctly. So I could keep going on that, but let me stop and see if I answered that question.
Okay. Well, Stephanie, do you have any comments, observations on that?
I mean, generally speaking, I guess if I understood the question correctly, it sounds to me like by default, I kind of just start thinking of like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like we have to care for folks' physiological and safety, very basic needs, to then be able to kind of transcend that and, put people in like a situation where, you know, the more kind of societal needs can also be met. So when I'm thinking about, transportation equity or, a lot of folks will ask me, how do we get more Black people cycling, for example? It's like there's a lot of different barriers that I can talk about that affect a lot of different people and not just Black people, but we have to kind of see it from the very like basic, fundamental, do folks have access to the basic, if you don't have food to eat, are you going to be thinking about a bicycle? Like we have to think about at the most fundamental level if those needs are met before we can kind of start talking about the next thing.
Absolutely. And to that point, I think one of the big challenges we often face would be we usually do host open houses about projects that are coming up on the roads, and yet too often it's the same people who attend those open houses. What kind of things do you envision that can help get those people, get a greater range of the community, especially those who might be most benefited or most impacted, to participate in that conversation? Joliette, do you?
So you and I talked about this a little bit. So for the group, Lafayette is planning to do its first transportation plan. Other cities and counties already have one or on their second or third, but the city I work for hasn't had one before. And one thing that we were talking about even before COVID is how do we reach everyone to get their opinions? Yes, there are people that come to every council meeting to voice their opinion. There are people that can come to public meetings, but there are people that work 9 to 5 or have 2 jobs and can't come to meetings. And now with COVID, it's even harder. So how do we reach everyone virtually? And one thing we're going to do is we're going to do a request for proposals to collect or to select a consultant. And I want to see a consultant give me a good plan for how we reach our population. That's going to be a big weighting factor on who we select. Before COVID, I was actually thinking of going into having meetings in the community. So Lafayette has a large mobile home population. And I was thinking of just trying to get the word out, and then just being somewhere in that community to talk to people. Now with COVID, that's harder, but I believe we can figure something out.
Great. Now, Nick, I know with your position, it's not necessarily planning and outreach, but have you been involved previously in plans for street changes? Do you have any observations on what works and what helps engage people?
Yeah, we do attend the community meetings and a lot of those and see what the community wants to do. The main thing that I noticed is time and place. Just like Joliette said, these people are working like 1 or 2 jobs sometimes. They have kids. They don't have time to get to these meetings at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Like they can't afford to do it. So I think the timing is a huge issue, and also the place. If you're going to change something in the community, you should have the meetings in that community. Those members shouldn't have to take a bus or get a lift or call a ride to get to a meeting to talk about something that's going to affect them. So I think those are were my 2 main takeaways. And like you said, Elaine, it gets to the point where you start to see those same faces in all those meetings. And that's the point I kind of got to, like before COVID, you're just seeing the same faces at all the meetings. So yeah, time and place for me are the 2 main things as far as reaching the community, for sure.
Okay. And obviously in some communities, transportation infrastructure is generally first oriented to automobiles. And it also seems like in some of the neighborhoods where maybe they have the higher need for an ability to walk or bike, they might not have complete sidewalks or bikeways, which then leads, I always wonder, what comes first? Do we need to reach out to communities of color and say, we'd like to see you on bikes more, or do we need to provide infrastructure first? Joliette, do you?
I would say the infrastructure needs to be there to every neighborhood, regardless of any of financial status, any of that. It should just be there. That's our job as governments to provide that infrastructure. So again, going back to planning, figuring out where we are lacking bike lanes, where we're lacking good sidewalks, where we're lacking trails, is key for people in the government to do, get financed, and then get built. As far as getting people on bikes, there are various programs I'm sure you're aware of to help promote it. But again, it's the reaching the people that don't have time to look at the little web flashes on the city's website. How do we get that information out once we get the infrastructure in? Of that, I'm not sure.
Nick, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with Juliette. It's in the infrastructure. And I think at a point, like talking about being in transportation and going to these meetings and talking to different people, I kind of feel like the wagon is put before the horse in a lot of situations. And that's a deeper conversation, of course, as far as tax dollars and things like that. But yeah, I think it's infrastructure first. Because like I noticed a lot of people in the communities that we serve, they do use bikes, but they use them to get to work and to go get their kid or whatever. They run errands and things like that. So they're not using it for these leisurely rides and things. So they don't get the same attention as people who do. And that boils down to infrastructure again. You know, it's I think it becomes a deeper conversation at some point.
Yeah. And what about you, Stephanie, with how, I guess I would like to preface with, I'm curious, how often do you ride your bike, Stephanie, for your errands just to get around versus the recreational riding?
It looks a little different now from where I live. And I say that because I used to live in the City Park area, And now I live in more like Montclair, and like I have 2 grocery stores a block down. So now I just walk, where before I used to like take my bike and take my trailer to the grocery store. So that looks different. And now that I'm in grad school, I have significantly less time for myself anyway. But I've been cycling a lot. I would say maybe like twice a week now. Um, and you know, sometimes it's pretty short, like going to the park, like I go to Cheeseman or City Park. Sometimes it's, you know, I'll go for a 60-mile ride. It just kind of depends. Also with Black Girls Do Bike right now, we're kind of on things are in a holding pattern until we get the green light from our founder to Monica Garrison to kind of resume these kind of group rides. But to the conversation or the question earlier, I'm not at all, I don't work in transit. I do not have experience with this, only my own personal experience. And I guess I'm just curious because I tend to be kind of reluctant to this idea of like, you know, you build it and then they'll come kind of thing. And I say that because I feel like perhaps before we do anything, I just feel like there needs to be like a huge cultural shift in the way that we do things in the US in general. Um, you know, the auto industry, and, you know, they have a lot of money and a lot of resources and very strong lobbying. And I think that kind of plays a part into, you know, why we don't have, you know, high speed rails and things like that that you see in other places. So I'm just curious if it's, you know, which, you know, the chicken or the egg thing, if it really, the infrastructure has to come first, because I do agree that that has to be more normalized and should be everywhere. But, you know, how do we also make sure that we keep equity in mind? And kind of Elaine spoke to this earlier, you know, lower income people have significantly less streetlights, are less likely to live in a place with sidewalks. So, you know, how do we make sure to prioritize the folks that need it more, or, you know, the people that haven't been kind of on an equal playing field? And you know, do we do that first, and then we imagine that folks will be using the infrastructure, or, you know, which one comes first? I don't know, with your direct experience, Nick and Joliette.
So we kind of addressing this, but there's a question from the audience. Celeste asks, it feels like there's an assumption that communities want multimodal infrastructure. Many times lower income communities are impacted by environmental issues, which results in a lack of desire to be outside. Should that air quality piece be the central focus versus the addition of a bike lane? Stephanie, do you want to respond to that?
I would agree with that for sure. I think these same, you know, predominantly Black, predominantly people of color, lower income communities are definitely on the front lines as it relates to climate issues. You know, the extent to which we seriously, you know, measure and try to reduce kind of pollutants and carbon, you know, from the transportation system, you know, the extent to which we invest in things that we don't need and don't invest in, you know, really kind of setting and aggressively trying to meet emission reduction goals and things like that. And yeah, I guess I think it all perhaps can kind of lend itself to like one larger conversation of all the steps that need to be taken to meet certain goals. You know, how do we include the planners and the engineers and the city, you know, and as well as, you know, scientists, and like to what extent are we actually like relying on like peer reviewed and empirical research to kind of move the needle on that, and you know, in a comprehensive way. But I absolutely agree that I think climate is a big issue, and just like all these issues with policy and equity, it affects, you know, the frontline folks, you know, minorities and lower income more so than others.
And then Nick, you're in an area with a high level of impact, being Northeast Denver region.
Yes.
Do you find your communities pretty sensitive and aware of air quality issues? And
Yeah, they are for sure. Yeah, they are. They know what's going on. Everyone knows what's going on. So I don't. It's a lot of issues rolled into one, and I don't think, like to Stephanie's point, I totally understand where she's coming from. I just think it's hard to be laser focused on like one issue. I think it's 100 of them that need to be worked on at once. So I think that's part of the conversation also.
Joliette, did you have anything to add?
I will just mention that from the government side of things, when we are trying to get state or federal funds to support various projects, a lot of our transportation projects have criteria when they judge them or rank them. And air quality, or how does this help air quality, is a typical criteria in those type of grant applications. So I think it's pretty well known that that is the goal of transportation, is one of the goals is to improve air quality. And if you can show for governments that you have a project that is going to, you know, reduce single occupant vehicles, and while you can't say 100% what that's going to equate to in a reduction in air quality, the implication is there that that should help, and that helps you get your grants, get your funding for your projects. So on our side of things.
Which, yeah, once again, maybe we've kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to present a question from Lori with the chamber. What does culture change, maybe shifting from driving modes to other modes, look like? And is it approached differently with an equity lens? Can you respond to that, Joliette?
With an equity lens. It's kind of difficult to respond to, because I'm thinking of this area in Boulder, where we're not as diverse as like Denver. You know, we're generally talking about changing modes, getting away from the single occupant cars. There really isn't, aside from reaching vulnerable populations with like microtransit, I think is that really what the question is about? I'm sure I understand the question.
Yeah, thanks, Joliette. Really, and I didn't mean to stump you.
Okay.
Really, what I want is to you know, kind of with a level of sensitivity. You know, we're aspirationally looking for culture change, or we might be looking for culture change. And does, you know, I mean, I don't know what culture change processes look like. That's not my area of expertise. I'm sure there are people who know that. But is there another layer or lens that you use when considering diverse populations or an equity lens to move that needle? Because, you know, I just make up, if you want to get, you know, X person to move from A to B, with one population, it might look different for other populations.
I think I understand where you're going with that. So getting more into the details of that, speaking more to the city that I work for example, the cities around us have FlexRide. We don't have FlexRide, but we're getting it for a brief period through Boulder County and a grant. And the goal of it is it is free for vulnerable populations to be able to get around Lafayette. And it's not just for vulnerable populations because of the grant, it had to kind of be open to everyone, but that was the goal. So that's more of a specific example of what you're talking about. And another example, which I think is related, is, for example, that we have new Boulder County affordable housing going in. And when that goes in the planning process, we're like, okay, are you going to get transit to this location? Or do we have suitable walks? We want to make sure that they get everything they need to be successful. We don't typically have a lot of high density, but for the affordable housing, that's pretty much our highest density. So we want to make sure we get what they need, and that's in the planning process.
Great. And just to kind of build on that, does that outreach look different? I know there's been a lot of talk about meeting in community and really engaging in community. Anything else that you know, any additional advice that you have around that piece, you know, kind of getting the input ahead of time, obviously?
I'm not sure. For the new, we're not really calling it FlexRide because we're not allowed to do it. We're not allowed. We're not doing it through RTD, so it won't be called FlexRide. But Boulder County is just amazing with their outreach, and also they're using commuting solutions. to help with that effort as well. And they have a lot of contacts. So I'm not exactly familiar with everything they do, but I know they've got it handled. So for that particular project, we're covered. But in general, if we didn't have the big hitters like Boulder County and Community Solutions with us, it'd be more difficult because we don't have that necessarily in-house. But we would find a way to make it happen.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add, Laura, to your question though. I think generally speaking, and this is again doesn't come from like transit as much, but I'm also part of the Denver Women's Commission, and we talk about these things of like, you know, where we have our monthly meetings, we'll dictate, you know, who comes and that kind of thing. And I do think kind of having, just because you asked about the equity lens, like not only to Nick's point of like actually going into the community, but also, you know, like who do you all hire? You know, who's involved not only in the public forum, but who actually works for you all? What kind of insight are you all getting, you know, when you're making your decisions? And to the extent possible, like where, you know, where do you prioritize your dollars? You know, where you all spend, where do you all prioritize the areas that you all serve? You know, at least in Denver, I feel like every time we get a new bike lane, it's always, you know, in downtown or especially protected bike lanes, that's where you see it. You don't see it out in Aurora. So like things like that, like how do you make those decisions with equity in mind? And also even when you do have these meetings, you know, with COVID now, a lot of folks, obviously like us, like we're doing this virtually, you know, who has internet access, who doesn't? When you're doing the outreach, what languages are you using for that outreach and what languages are you using in the actual meetings? You know, so this meeting right now probably wouldn't be very, you know, open to folks that speak Spanish only, for example. So just kind of keeping all of those things in mind and like knowing the areas that you were, and I mean, all things considered, again, you all just, you know, mentioned when you're in Boulder, it's significantly more homogenous. So probably looks a little different than the way that you would do something in Denver or even a more kind of diverse area. But I think in just absolutely everything that you do, from every email that you send to every dollar that you spend, is just kind of keeping that in mind of, you know, keeping different communities and underserved communities in mind.
Great, thanks, Stephanie.
Which brings me to an interesting point that I was looking up some demographic information, and, you know, it's no surprise that Boulder is 90% white. But what did take me a little bit by surprise is that the poverty rate in Boulder is actually higher than it is in Denver, in even New York City. So, you know, while we may not always have communities of color that are who are underserved, there are obviously communities that probably are not having that same voice at the table. And, you know, it's just another of the realms of how are we making the variety of forms of transportation available to a broader range of people. Nick, have you had success in just helping your community bike more safely?
Bike more safely, a little. We do have a lot of programs though. We run a shuttle program, and we also we do like a carpool program where we offer a $20 incentive if they do take 20 trips a month.
Uh-oh. Nick?
That's been, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's.
Oh dear. Nick looks a little frozen. Joliette, what about in your area?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question one more time?
Well, just, yeah, I feel like we have touched on this a bit, but just making sure that there is access for bicycles and options, I really should say, not just bikes, but that it's for making sure it's safe for people of all color, but also just that, you know, there is a higher poverty level in our region than I think some people are aware.
What From my perspective, working for a city, you're supposed to make sure transportation is accessible to everybody. That's just the goal. You don't, if there is an inequity there, it should be, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but basically figure out where our inequities are and then a plan to remove those barriers. Some cities have great plans already, some don't. So we're going to be working on ours, but until you have that plan, until you know where your problems are, they're just going to stay in that condition, unfortunately. Another unfortunate, for me, what I believe to be true is that in a lot of lower income areas, and I'm not just talking about Louisville or Lafayette or the places that I've worked, but just in general, everyone's busy and they may know of a problem and not really have time to even advocate for having that problem addressed. But it really is important for the government officials to know that the problems exist. Unfortunately, often the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you're busy, you don't squeak. I mean, I don't complain. I live in Broomfield. I don't complain about my street. It's still drivable. It's fine. Whereas other people may complain and they're getting done even though their street is in much better condition than mine. That's just how things go. So I think it's really important to have a good list of the inequities or a good map of the inequities so that the city council or county commissioners or state officials can make informed decisions on how or where funds are spent. Now, do we need to have micro transit? Do we need to have cross-city transit? Do we need to have, make sure what we know we want them, but to make sure our trails connect so that our trail system doesn't just suddenly end at some spot, that we actually can get that person on the trail to where they're trying to go, even if that means cross-jurisdictional coordination. So the plan really needs to come first and document, that's the word I couldn't think of, Lord, document as many of these issues and inequities as possible. So did Nick come back?
Yeah, I think he's back. And
Yeah, I'm back. I actually had to connect on my phone. Sorry about that.
oh, no problem. But Joliette, to your point, it makes me wonder, is there a place for local advocates? In another role in my life, I'm involved with community cycles. And at times we have gone out for the City of Boulder to review what's going on in areas and been able to identify a street corner where the curb cut is not sufficient, where there are potholes in bike lanes. Would this make a difference to just really draw on local activists and advocates who can help see what's going on in neighborhoods to potentially improve that?
I think advocates from the community are very important. Again, the problem with that is the squeaky wheel. So someone may say, I really want this here. I think it would really help people here. Okay, that costs X. And if we do that, we can't do Y and Z. So it's still a balancing act, especially with funding. But we have to know the problem exists. And it needs to be something that's, unfortunately, it needs to be, I shouldn't say unfortunately, it needs to be measurable. Because if I say there's a problem and everyone else says there's the same problem on their street, what do we do first? So that's hard on my end of things to prioritize improvements. There's some obvious things, like I would rather no one on a trail system had to cross an arterial at grade. I'd rather everybody go under, preferably not over, but under. That's a lot of money. So you have to prioritize how we do these projects. There are small projects that can make a difference. Bike lanes are typically striping, and depending on how you protect the bike lanes, if you do concrete, that's more expensive, but typically that's a smaller cost And if you have the space, it's doable. The bigger projects, like getting people under busy streets, that could be in the millions of dollars. So figuring out the problems and prioritizing them it's key for every government agency.
Nick, did you have any thoughts on that?
Can you repeat the question for me?
Well, we were just talking about where there are gaps and issues in our transportation network. A lot of the times, the areas that get the most attention are where there's the squeakiest wheels, and it's often that same community, and it may be a more affluent community who has the luxury of time to communicate about it. And are there other people we can engage? Are there local advocates and activists that maybe could get involved to help evaluate where there are issues in a local community?
Yeah, I think getting in touch with community leaders, like the prominent organization in a community, is a good first step. Like, we have great relationships with Focus Points, and Ken, my colleague, he actually worked on something where he worked with Native Roots and got a lot of people to go through Focus Points to get hired. We work with Diane with Fava and Montbella, which has been a great relationship. And I think it's just dealing with that community organization that the community deals with. And then you can get your message out, or you can get any answers that you need from there. That's really that's basically how it's worked for us. And I see it's a really good process. So you do need to engage with the community that you're trying to get into. That's really the basic way for me. I think you just have to go where you want to do the change is where you need to go. Like, people they don't need to be making decisions for different communities. If you want an answer, you need to ask the person that you're trying to help. And that's our bottom line.
And, Stephanie, so with your organization, is it more trying to just get more people on their bikes and comfortable with the biking, or are you ever doing outreach to look at what is the infrastructure and how do we make it better?
For the most part, it's mostly focused on the writing. Like, it's more focused on, the multitude of reasons that, like, Black women and women of color are just underrepresented in cycling, and really trying to really help, like, encourage and motivate people to do that and take up on that. So really the vast majority of what we do is, like, get together and ride together. And some of the difficulties with cycling is that typically when you're not riding for sport, that's not really what's like highlighted or marketed. What's highlighted is like racing typically, or kind of being more of riding longer distances and things like that. So I think a part of it, though, like, kind of inherently, like, we kind of gravitate toward having those discussions, but it's not so much of a part of what we do, even though I think there's definitely opportunity for it, to just kind of get involved and pointing out some of those issues that we have in our own community. We live all over the place in Denver too, so kind of getting a better sense of, like, how we can use our voices to kind of talk about these things. So some of the research that I do personal life is about civic engagement, and I think the only thing about it is that, as much as I think community engagement is huge and fundamental, and, like, you can't do much change without it, I also think that it's, like, inherently the responsibility, like, the actual onus ought to be on the government and just organizations like that. So it's not to say that community leaders can get together and voice their concerns, because that's what democracy is. I just also think that we also shouldn't wait for that. And I think that the government should be more proactive in actually looking toward what, essentially what Joliette said, mapping these inequities. Like, you can't solve issues that you're not aware of. And I think in some cases, different organizations choose what they want to be aware of, and you know, what they want to ignore. And I think one of the issues is that engagement is inherently classist. It's inherently exclusive because, you know, Nick already spoke about this, you know, who can make those meetings, what time they have, you know, if you have multiple jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So, but like by default, no matter how hard you try, there's going to be people missing from those forums. So I just think it's also important not only to go to them, but to essentially, you know, kind of use your own resources to get a sense for like what those issues like within the community essentially already are. And I also kind of think that it's important to just realize like the extent to which like certain underserved areas are like ceremoniously underserved, and it gets to the point where they don't think anything's going to be done anyway, so they're not going to call about the light bulb that's out, and they're not going to call about the broken sidewalk because they have years and years and decades of being ignored and their needs being ignored. So I think there has to be more a proactive nature from the folks with the resources to make those changes.
Excellent. I have one more question, but I do want to make sure anybody listening, attending, please let us know. We've had some great stuff coming up in the chat I've been trying to get to, but we also want to hear from you. I'm curious about, like, with Vision Zero, there's the whole goal of we need to create safe streets. And of course, I think sometimes we need an awareness that how I define a safe street might be one thing. And here we are in this context where crimes against Black people, Black men especially, George Floyd died in the street. And safe streets can be different things. Vision Zero has that component. You know, they talk about the 4 E's, one of which is enforcement. Do you think there are ways we can shift enforcement? Would using more red light or speed cameras be helpful? What can we do in this goal for safer streets and Vision Zero that does not create such an inequity? Stephanie, are you game to take that one on?
It's a big question. I'm trying to like think about like, you know, the mission of Vision Zero, and I know I've seen it, but essentially it's, you know, mostly to eliminate traffic deaths and, you know, fatal crashes and things like that, right?
And in engineering and evaluation are components which are crucial, but to me, I think we just need to question that the level of enforcement and what happens.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, when you say enforcement, are you talking about law enforcement or? Yeah, poof, it's a heavy question. Nick and Joliette,
you can take a simple choice. Would just speed cameras make a difference? Does that feel like that would be potentially more equitable than relying on officers pulling people over?
I would say that yes, if they work the way we would like them to work. So unfortunately, speed cameras and red light cameras, one, it's a system and it requires a whole backbone of support for ticketing and taking people to court for their tickets. It's not just one camera up there and the problem is solved. That's an entire system. And unfortunately, those systems have some, they're not necessarily reliable. And I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but if they worked and they were foolproof and government agencies could afford to have those systems, that would probably help. That'd be less for officers to do and less interactions between officers and the public. But I just don't think those systems are there yet, or that agencies smaller than the big ones like Boulder and Denver and maybe Aurora could really run those systems effectively.
Nick?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Elaine. I really don't. As far as transportation goes, I don't really know if I have a clear answer. That particular question, I don't know. It makes me think about systematic change and personal biases that technology can't fix. So I don't think red light cameras would have helped George Floyd not be killed in the street. So, and that's a systematic and biases problem that's going on within departments and within individuals. So, yeah, I'm really not sure I can answer that question through a transportation lens. I would need a little bit more clarity.
Stephanie, was there something you were about to?
No, I agree with Joliette. I think, so, if the question is, will implementing these cameras kind of, reduce these interactions with police? In some ways, well, for one, I think anything that I say at this point, I'm just speculating because I don't know what the research shows. I don't know, in communities that have already done that, if they've seen that, perhaps. I would think so, though. And I do think there's less of a need to have more, cops out there pulling people over for those things if the technology supports it. And I would rather get a $300 ticket than get pulled over by a cop personally. So there's that, but I don't think that would be a panacea for all of these policing issues that we have, to Nick's point. And I don't think that was your question anywhere or what you were suggesting, but I think with policing, there's just fundamental issues with why we even have police, the actual need for police, the extent to which they surveil mostly, lower income and people of color, the way that they behave with those communities, even when it doesn't end up fatal, the trust issues, non-cooperation that stems from hundreds of years of violence at the hands of police. I mean, there's just so many things. But if the point is, to the extent to just have safer streets and, make sure folks are not running red lights or speeding and that kind of thing. Yeah, I do think that cameras, I guess, can help with. But even then, I feel like it could be a slippery slope, right? Like, where are you putting these cameras? Are you putting them in predominantly Black areas, or are you putting them everywhere? What areas are you kind of prioritizing? Is it based on where people already speed? Those kinds of things. And even if you are using that research on where people already speed, then there's already issues in where cops are more likely to find people speeding based on where they're sent to do their surveillance. So I think it could be very problematic in many ways, but I think if it's done right, I think it could be one step, but it's certainly not gonna fix all of the issues, of course, with policing.
Okay. Did anybody from the audience have a question for our panelists? Because if not, I'm going to dive in with one more, which was, I was curious looking through different careers, especially in speaking with Joliette. I asked you how you got into the field, and what did you say? You couldn't walk for architecture. In architecture, fewer than 1 in 5 new architects identify as people of color. In planning, 80% of planners are white, with Asians the next highest. With engineering, white men account for 49% of the engineering field. So how do we open up these careers to have more people in careers that help influence who is making these decisions?
I would go back to when I was younger, back in Florida. There was a program, I want to say it was called TRACK, but it was, maybe that wasn't it, something like that, but it was designed to introduce kids to some of the basic elements of civil engineering. And I went into a couple of schools with very kind of rudimentary projects to show them physics or something like a little bridge project, just to get them interested and tell them what I did, so they could see a face of color and a woman that's doing this job, to realize, oh, I can do that too. So I've done that before. I don't think I've done that since I've been in Colorado, but programs like that are immensely helpful for young kids to see that people of color are out there, that they are doing these types of jobs, and it's not something that's completely out of the realm of possibility. So I would love to do that again, but I don't think I've really seen a program like that around here.
Stephanie or Nick?
Yeah, I work in higher ed, so I think that's, there's absolute room for essentially, creating more bridge programs and kind of introducing, to Joliette's point, like introducing folks like really young, that informs why I even, lead the Black Girls Do Bike. The essence is, if you see more Black women on bikes, you may feel compelled to do it too. I did a big tour in 2016, and I try to talk about it, as often as I can to a lot of, Black cyclists and cyclists of color, and to get them introduced to bike touring, which, like Joliette said, is not outside of the realm of possibility, but it is when you don't see it, when it's not marketed to you, when it's, when you don't see folks in your community or in your peer network or whatever doing these things, and it kind of becomes more foreign to you, and it becomes something that you just kind of think is not doable for you. So yeah, I definitely think that's kind of where there's a piece for not only secondary education, but for higher education to really take on those roles. There's a lot of different, just so many grants out there that are focused on getting more, students of color into STEM careers. But I think it also needs to be here. It needs to be in architecture and engineering and all of these, engineering is part of STEM, but I don't know if architecture and planning, I don't think it falls into that. So not only seeing those careers, but also that is the pathways to those career, both with education and without, just kind of getting folks more interested in this, and just knowing what, that it's even a career choice that they can, aspire to.
Would you like to share with us about Agile Mile? Make sure we get that in.
Yeah, so I know Elaine put together a lot of these really great resources and links, and if you'd like to screenshot this, I think this is a great list of various different resources for you to look at as people that are participating in this discussion further past this session. But also Agile Mile is a TDM resource, so transportation demand management resource. And they created this awesome scholarship opportunity for increasing people of color getting into urban planning fields and computer science fields. So if you guys know of anyone that might be a person of color who is currently studying in these types of programs or has an interest in pursuing these fields in the future, they're offering 2 $1,500 scholarships. The deadline is July 31st, I believe, for the applications, and we'll be sending out a recording and links to these resources after the session is over sometime later today. So feel free to pass that information along to anyone that you think might benefit from that. And we definitely, as an organization, I would say, think that we need to do a better job of not only getting people of color and marginalized groups into the conversation with these issues, but also making sure that they're in our industry is super important too, as all the panelists have been talking about.
Yeah. As we're wrapping up, I do have a question for Stephanie from Lauren, wondering how her community can start a chapter of Black Girls Do Bike, and then also just any closing thoughts that you would like to share with us.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to read it here, but I'm sorry, is the question how to start a chapter of Black Girls Do Bike? Oh, okay. So I'm guessing this person is maybe not in a different area of Colorado, I'm guessing, or maybe not.
Not
oh. Okay. It's very simple. It couldn't be simpler, actually. So you would just kind of reach out to Monica, who is the founder, and you just kind of create a Facebook, and that's literally it. I mean, the only responsibility that folks have is to just lead a monthly ride. Like, that's kind of the expectation. And of course, if you can't for whatever reason, it's fine. But that's really, the extent to which you'll, take on more responsibility, which I certainly have. It's kind of up to the person and up to their capacity and their bandwidth. But it's going to take a lot of outreach to build the group. For me, it's been a lot of poaching other groups, like Outdoor Afro and like Black Girls Run and other affinity groups like that, spreading the word and kind of through word of mouth. I think we're now like at just short of like 200 members or something like that. But that's really it. That's the only expectation. And I think there is a number of, assuming this person is an Ithaca, I think, because it's next to their name, Lauren. There's a lot of other ones in New York, and I can put you in touch if you want to shoot me an email. I can put you in touch with some of the leaders of chapters in New York State to just kind of share ideas and things like that. Yeah, and then just generally speaking, thank you all for including me in this. Again, I'm not by any means a transit equity expert, or nor do I have professional experience in it, but definitely happy to share my piece and share what I know, and definitely welcome everyone here to kind of take this conversation back to wherever they work, and making sure that not only they take that equity lens into what they do, but also kind of push for that, especially if they may not have the discretion, they don't oversee the budget or oversee the decisions that are made, but making sure that not only are these discussions brought to the table, but that also that people like, the people with kind of that direct experience or from more underserved communities are actually being heard and being hired and being paid and compensated for their time and treasure and talent. And yeah, I think that obviously there's an interest in that. Otherwise, you all wouldn't have joined this conversation. So thank you all for your time.
Yeah. Nick, do you have any closing thoughts to share?
No, nothing much. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Joliette and Stephanie, for being on the panel. And yeah, just to echo what Stephanie said, just if you guys want a better look in the community, hire people from the community, empower people from the community. We're all the same. We want the same things as affluent neighborhoods. And it's really as simple as that. And I want to thank you guys for listening to what I had to say.
And Joliette, that leaves you to share your final thoughts.
Well, I want to just thank you for including me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, my computer is acting strangely. Thank you for including me. This has been very positive, and it's great to see and meet like-minded people. And some of the information provided in the chat is awesome. I'm going to look more into that. Communication is key in everything, knowing the right people to connect to, and then being able to connect with our own communities, with the kids in the schools, and then the people working day to day. That's everything. We can't do a good job. I can't do a good job as a government employee if I don't make those connections and get the right information to my council and my bosses. So this has been amazing. I really appreciate it. And feel free to provide my information to the other members of the panel and anyone that attended if they would like to talk to me further.
Well, I just really want to thank you all for taking the time out today to speak with us. It's just good to have this kind of conversation I feel like we all have common goals, I think, of allowing people access to get around and do it safely and not totally relying on vehicles, but to get around a community and feel a part of our community. We at BTC do a lot of work with people and businesses in Boulder and trying to help them rethink their commutes. And of course, like everybody, we've had to shift gears a little bit in our focus of work because people are generally at home, and it's been really intriguing to me the different conversations we are having by being virtual. It's great that you can join us today without having to just come up to Boulder. And I cannot thank you enough for being part of it, for everybody attending. We will have the slides and video available, so feel free to share that with anybody you know that you think would find this conversation interesting. And we'll look forward to moving forward with these kind of conversations about how to keep communities engaged and helping everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Elaine.